So we have a good group already, Mark, and like I said, a few folks might keep filtering in, but I'm going to go ahead and say hello and welcome to everybody who joined us so far, and welcome to this month's Friends from the Field webinar. These monthly webinars are brought to you by the Blue Hill Heritage Trust, as well as the Island Heritage Trust. My name is Brooke McDonald, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Blue Hill Heritage Trust. And I am joined by Dr. Mark Pokras, who I'm going to turn it over to in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to just let everyone know that we will, if you have a question, like a clarifying question during the presentation, please go ahead and pop it in the chat or the Q&A. If you have a question that, we might save it till the end, we're probably going to do more of the Q&A in the end. But if you take your mouse and hover over the bottom of the screen, of your Zoom screen, you'll see all the little icons pop up. And we'll be looking at the chat and the Q&A. So go ahead and put questions in those two places. One of those two places, either one works. And we will answer questions as we go or save them for the end, depending on what they are and our timing. So this webinar is called Loon CSI, Figuring Out Threats to Loons. And our presenter, as I said, is Dr. Mark Pokras, Emeritus Associate Professor of Wildlife Medicine, former Director of the Tufts Wildlife Clinic and Tufts Center for Conservation Medicine. Mark has been involved in wildlife conservation and rehabilitation for over 50 years and has worked with local, state, national, and international groups on educational and research efforts. He's extensively studied the effects of lead poisoning and bioaccumulation of other toxins in loons and other aquatic animals. I'm one of the countless students that Mark has mentored. I worked with him closely as a grad student, and I'm really excited to have him here with us today. So I'm going to shut off my screen, Mark, but I'm right here, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Brooke. Hopefully everybody can hear me all right. And if you can't, as Brooke said, put something in the chat or the Q&A so we can make sure everybody can see what's going on. And we'll see if the screen share works well. So let me immediately switch over to that. Can you see my screen? Brooke, are you seeing that?
I see your screen. Right now it looks like your computer screen. So
exactly. There we go. Yeah,
there we go. Got it.
Yay. Okay. It looks like this is going to work. All right. So let me briefly introduce myself. Yeah, as Brooke said, I most of my career has been as a wildlife veterinarian. But I have strong ties to Tufts, where I spent most of my career, but also to Maine, where I have vacationed for a long time. But my wife's family is entirely from the greater sort of Blue Hill Peninsula area, and we've had a camp on Toddy Pond for approaching 40 years. So I know the area and I know loons there pretty well. Let me give you a quick introduction to what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of loon conservation, about the biology of loons in general. I'm going to talk about some of our work. And this is one of those things. This is a different loon talk. This first slide, you can see this absolutely gorgeous picture of this adult loon in flight. But a lot of what I do, it's the CSI piece. It's not observing beautiful live loons in the field. It's figuring out after they're injured or found dead, why they died. And so this may not be quite as happy a story as some of the loon talks that you've heard before. And I will warn you ahead, there are a few sort of semi-gross pictures in here. Nothing too graphic, I hope, but I do want to let you know that they're coming through the program. So that said, let's go. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is connecting loon health to, animal health in general, aquatic health in general, and even human health. And how can we make a difference in understanding all these things? Of course, we're used to common loons, but remember that there are 5 species of loons in the world. But our species, the common loon, is the only one that breeds in the lower 48 states. The others are they're boreal. They're more Arctic species. And in the Northeast, Maine is the state with the largest number of loons. If you look at the lower 48, Minnesota has many more loons than all the other states put together. But Maine is a loon stronghold here in the Northeast. So a little bit about loon biology. Piscivorous means that they're basically fish eaters, although they do eat other things, and we can talk about that. They're interesting in that they're breeding on freshwater, but for much of their lives, for about half of their annual cycle, they're a marine species. They spend most of their time on the ocean, and they don't begin breeding until they're older, until they're 5, 6, 7 years old. And many of those first few years are also spent on the ocean. So think of these not just as lake birds, but very much as marine birds as well. And they have relatively low reproductive potential, and that's important to keep in mind. They rarely have more than 1 or 2 chicks per year. It's not like ducks or even bald eagles that can have 4 or 5 at a time. But these are long-lived birds, so protecting the health of breeding adults is particularly important. It mentions on the last slide that they're extremely specialized for aquatic existence, and that's so important to remember in that loons can't walk on land. They can push themselves along with their feet. They can't stand up and walk, and they can't perch on anything. You'll never see a loon perched in a tree or on a telephone line or anything like that, as you might a cormorant. And so when loons nest, they typically nest like this one, right next to the water, where they can effectively push themselves off the nest into the water. This will come up later on as an issue. Loons typically lay 2 eggs. There's about a 28 to 30-day incubation period. They're about the size of goose eggs. And when the eggs hatch, you get these absolutely gorgeous, fuzzy little black chicks. And one of the interesting things, and again, emphasizing how aquatic loons are, is the eggs hatch, these little fuzzy black chicks sit with the parents for the first day or 2, but at about 2 days, they jump off the nest into the water, and oftentimes they're not back on land until their breeding age. So they may be in the water full time for the next several years. We often see on calendars these just wonderful pictures of loon chicks on the parents' backs. Loons are not the only species that you'll see this. You'll see this with mergansers, with a number of other water birds, probably a number of biological reasons for this. One, the chicks get chilled quickly, and this helps them stay up out of the cold water and get warm. It also can protect them from aquatic predators. Some of the big predatory fish or snapping turtles, for whom a chick is just bite-sized. The chicks grow up fast. They're fed entirely by the adults at this age, and this is about 4.5, 5-week-old chick in its second coat of down. They go from the black down to a brown down, but growing very quickly, eating voraciously at this age. Loons are incredible underwater swimmers, and unlike penguins or alcids, auks and murres and things like that, they're not using their wings to swim underwater. They're using their legs entirely. And we'll see if I can very briefly show you a minute of a YouTube video here. But let's see if that will pop up. All right, we get the ads. That wasn't supposed to happen. All right, we'll get out of this in just a second. There we go. So for those of you who've never seen loons swimming underwater, we'll just watch a minute of this on this lake in Ontario. And they are incredibly streamlined, incredibly fast swimmers, and they can stay underwater a long time when they want to. And I'm sure we've all had the experience of watching a loon go underwater and waiting for it to come up, and either having it come up very far away or never seeing it go back to the surface. So they're just fabulous animals to watch. Okay. So you can watch this YouTube video when you want later on. It goes for about a little over 2 minutes. When loons are in the water. They're very good divers, very good swimmers. As we said, they are incredibly awkward on land, and they're big, heavy birds with relatively small wings. They don't particularly like to fly. And so to get away from threats, they typically dive underwater and try and escape. They're really only flying to migrate, to take off from the lakes and head to the ocean or head from the ocean back to the lakes. And so these big heavy birds, they can't just jump up out of the water like a mallard duck can. They need a long runway and often a good headwind to get started. It takes a loon without a strong headwind about a quarter of a mile of running across the surface of the water to get going. When they leave the lakes, they're migrating to the marine environment for the winter. And as you see, the eastern breeding loons go to the east coast, the western breeding loons go to the west coast, and the loons in the center part of the continent go down to Baja or off the Gulf of Mexico. So our loons, for the most part, are not migrating very far south. A lot of our loons are migrating really just to the Maine coast or down to Cape Cod, New Jersey, that sort of thing. Again, just sort of a map of the same thing. The orange area is the area in which they breed. You'll see up on some of the Canadian islands and Greenland. They migrate across the central part of the continent and they're wintering for the most part on the ocean. There are some small populations that winter on fresh water. And if you want to, we can chat about that. In the winter, when they're not on their breeding lakes, they molt into a much more subdued plumage. And this is an adult loon in the winter. And a lot of people who see these on the ocean don't even recognize as loons, which is sometimes a problem during hunting season. Of course, we think of loons as incredibly charismatic. I've got my T-shirt. They appear on every item you can find in gift stores throughout New England, and we love them dearly, especially here in Maine. But let's talk a little bit about the history of people's interactions with loons. Certainly, indigenous people concentrated on loons. There are a lot of stories and artwork around loons. There are many indigenous legends, some ceremonial clothing made of loons, loon parts. But Western people really only came into contact with them when they started coming over to the New World. This is the earliest image I could find of a loon that was from 1585. This image is from the British Museum. And after this, of course, later naturalists and artists like Alexander Wilson and John James Audubon did more work on loons and sort of immortalized them and studied them a little bit, introduced the American population to them. But in the early days, I must say, loons were not popular. They were popular for target practice for people who wanted to try and shoot them, as Thoreau wrote about, or they were seen as threats to fisheries. Many states actually had bounties on loons. This was that predator prejudice that we had with wolves and loons and many different species. And so loons were largely eliminated from much of their breeding range by this predator prejudice, by development at lakes, by early pollution, by a lot of negative things. They were, in fact, a persecuted group of animals. This started to change in the late 1800s and sort of accelerated with the work of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt. But people were starting to write around 1900. It's too bad we don't hear loons anymore. They're gone. What's going on with this? People are starting to try and figure this out, but there were not much in the way of real studies. In fact, effectively, between about 1900 and 1952, this is all the work that was done on loons. William Brewster's monograph on birds of Lake Umbagog in Maine talked a lot about the loss of loons, about the shooting of loons, and how the introduction of motorboats had contributed to a decline in loons up there. Arthur Allen, who was the founder of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology, did some of the first recordings of loons. And in 1952, Sigurd Olson, this is the son of the famous naturalist Sigurd J. Olson, did his master's thesis on loons in Minnesota. And this was sort of a foundational document. But nobody did much work after that for a number of years until we got into the environmental movement. In 1962, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring really changed the world. We started looking at DDT and the decline in many species of birds, brown pelicans, peregrine falcons, bald eagles, and common loons. We had Earth Day, and this sort of refocused people on the environment and particularly on what was going on with water and aquatic species. And we get to a period where three very influential people got interested in loons, and sort of the queen of them, I call her the Jane Goodall of loon conservation, was Judy McIntyre, who did her PhD in Minnesota, sort of invented the loon nest raft and had some early, very influential publications. And I got a chance to visit with Judy a few years ago. She's in her early 90s now, is in Utica. And she really got a lot of things going in the Midwest. Here in the Northeast, it was Rawson Wood, who started his work in the Adirondacks, and then when he retired as a businessman, did a lot of work in New Hampshire, founded the Loon Preservation Committee in New Hampshire, and was very concerned about loon conservation. That right-hand picture is Rawson's 100th birthday party. The third one in Canada was Jack Barr, who started studying loons in around the area of Sudbury, Ontario, where there was a lot of pollution and mercury pollution. And the three of them were really very influential and started working with biologists like Gene Likens in the United States on acid rain issues and the effects of acid rain on lake quality, on fisheries, on mercury, and things of that nature. And of course, Canadian biologists were working on this at the same time. Joe Karakis in Nova Scotia, Rob Alvo, and Rob published a very influential article in Canadian Geographic on acid lakes and loons. And together they funded the North American Loon Fund, which for many years supported loon conservation. It was the biggest organization on the continent. Now, at the table there, we have Judy McIntyre, Rawson Wood, and Scott Sutcliffe putting all the organizational stuff together. And they really changed people's perceptions of loons. This was a big public relations campaign because they had to convince the public that loons weren't bad guys. They shouldn't be persecuted. And they did this through a number of means. One was putting out the recording by Bill Barklow of Voices of the Loon, and the other one was participating in the production of On Golden Pond, which really, I think, mesmerized the American public and gave people a very different view of loons. So today, we know from all this work that loons are facing a lot of different stresses. And if we want to have constructive, appropriate conservation programs, we have to figure out what are the big problems and what are the little problems, and how do we get at that? How do we do our best conservation as individuals and working with organizations? So following up on the North American Loon Fund, we have formed a Northeast Loon Study Working Group. This sort of has been around now for about 35 years. And we've got a bunch of organizations around New England involved in this group. We meet once annually at LPC, Loon Preservation Committee in New Hampshire. This was our last pre-COVID meeting. And we get about 40 biologists. And these days, we also have Zoom capabilities. So in addition to attending in person, if any of you want to be at these meetings, this year's meeting is March 12th and 13th, a Thursday and a Friday. And let us know if you'd like to attend in person or Zoom into the meetings. Basically, this large group has two kinds of studies going. One is the live loon studies, and we won't talk much about that today. And the other one is the mortality studies. What are the things that injure or kill loons? The live loon studies are being done by a lot of groups. We'll talk about some of those in a couple of minutes. The mortality studies I'm sort of in charge of. And so here in Maine, the educational programs and the live loon studies are really, for a long time, have been championed by Maine Audubon. And we've had a sequence of just marvelous people at Maine Audubon um, moving this forward. Tracy Hart is currently there. Gallo, of course, was at Maine Audubon for many years, is now running Maine Lakes, and fabulous people. We have a nonprofit consulting firm, BRI in Maine, led by Dave Evers, that's done worked on loons for many, many years and has focused largely on mercury studies and has been tremendously influential in this area. We've got a group of College of the Atlantic that I'm quite involved with and with some faculty there regularly on a whole variety of environmental issues, but especially loons. And of course, when you're in the Blue Hill MDI Maine area, there are other nonprofits that work a lot on loons. Maine Lakes, as I said, is involved. The Somes Minell Sanctuary on MDI, the Center for Wildlife down in York in the Cape Nettic area does wonderful education programs. And so it's the conjunction of all these groups watching loons in the field, educating the public about the issues, and then trying to figure out the threats that really is making a conservation difference regionally. This includes state and federal agencies. I love this picture of the National Park Service person putting out the loon platform and his nesting platform, and you can see the loon can't wait. Volunteers are important, and certainly if any of you want to get involved in any of these conservation programs around Maine or anywhere else, let us know and we can put you in touch with people in the appropriate organizations. One of the things, of course, that we want to talk about is things that you might get involved with. For instance, a lot of people on lakes or along loon migration pathways find loons that are in inappropriate places. Loons in migration sometimes crash land in funny places, especially wet roadways, or they land in ponds of water that aren't big enough to take off from in bad weather or during storms. This lower one on the left is actually in a decorative pool at the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas, I believe, a few years ago and had to be rescued. And so how does one do this? And if you should find a loon that is down, is it something you want to do or do you call an expert? Because loons are big and strong and they have this sharp beak. They can hurt you. Loons can be found on beaches all across the country because, as I said, they're marine species a lot of the time. They sometimes need to be rescued if they get frozen in the ice. And that's not something you want to do. You don't want to risk your life out on thin ice unless you've got appropriate training and equipment. And you never know where loons are going to show up when they crash land. So if you're going to rescue a loon, first of all, you got to stay away from the beak. Long necks, sharp beaks, they will poke holes in you. And you got to be very careful doing this. So it takes a knowledgeable person, and you've got to have the right container to put a loon in. Something that can be closed well, that's got air to it, that's got thick padding on the bottom so that loons won't injure their keels, their breasts, or their feet while they're in there, because they're not good at staying on land. Things that aren't good to put loons in are cardboard boxes. They'll peck their way out. Dog carriers. If a loon can see its way out of something, it will try and escape, and in doing that, they'll often injure themselves. So you have to have something that's appropriate to put the loon into. So this is one of those things where you might want to contact a rehabilitator or a game warden or something who's got the appropriate equipment. Same sort of thing with rehabilitation. You got to know what you're doing. Loons don't do well in captivity. There is not a zoo in the world ever that has succeeded at keeping a loon alive long-term in captivity. And so the secret to rehabilitating loons is get them in, get them diagnosed, and get them out as quickly as you can. Veterinary care, the same sort of thing. We can anesthetize them, we can do fancy procedures on them, but they are incredibly sensitive species in captivity. So if you find sick, injured, or dead loons here in Maine, there are some numbers that we can provide where you can find help. The Maine Warden Service is wonderful, the Center for Wildlife Assistance Hotline, and BRI's organization. They'll sometimes go out and help rescue loons. So we're going to get into now sort of my area, the CSI part of it, in that people find dead loons quite frequently. We get in New England about 160 dead loons a year for diagnostic procedures. And this, death is part of the normal life cycle. And if we're going to understand the needs of conservation, we have to understand why these birds are dying and what can we do about them. So finding them, identifying them, having people recover them and pick them up. We can talk at the end if you want about should you find a dead loon, what's a safe way to pick it up? We don't want anybody, getting into potentially infectious disease issues or things like that. And here's what we do. We find them and it becomes part of a scientific study. Taking photographs, keeping good records, and sharing the data is incredibly important. We have to tell what's normal and what's abnormal, both in terms of the anatomy and on things like x-rays. This has served as a basis for a tremendous number of undergraduate and graduate student projects. I love our students. They're wonderful. And this is the group up at College of the Atlantic doing a loon necropsy up there a couple of months ago. Dr. Edwin Barkdahl is the head of this study. And as you can see, we're being careful to protect human health because at the moment, we don't know why this bird is dead. So that's how dead loons come in. And on the lower right is sort of how a lot of them leave. We take a lot of tissue samples that go to laboratories all over the country for genetics, for toxicology, for infectious disease studies, all sorts of things. We take a lot of photos, we take a lot of measurements. And one of the things we're finding out, again, is normals. We find out a lot about food habits. What are they eating? And we classify the mortality. These are just some general categories, and we'll run through these fairly quickly. A lot of trauma, both natural and caused by people. So not many things can kill an adult loon, but bald eagles can. And this is a bald eagle, a loon that was killed by a bald eagle. And those colored pins in there are to show the talon wounds from the eagle grabbing the loon, and there's an eagle eating a loon. But many things, as I said earlier, will eat loon chicks. They're much more vulnerable. Another thing that I don't think people realized till we got into the mortality studies is loons fight viciously during the breeding season. They are incredibly territorial, both the males and the females, and they will injure one another and they will fight to the death with some frequency. And they've got those big, sharp beaks. They will put holes in one another. This is the sternum, the breastbone of a loon, and you can see those are holes. Adult loons trying to invade the territory of another loon will kill chicks from the other pair. And just as an example, this is the sternum, the breastbone of a female loon that we've prepared as a museum specimen. And all those holes in there are from previous loon fights. These are fights that female loon survived. We get into human-caused problems, and the list is much longer. Oil spills for anything on the water are just hugely problematic. Boat trauma, we see, people, whether they're in jet skis or other motorized craft, that sometimes are not being careful. And we see blunt trauma with fractures of all sorts, with internal bleeding from, again, being hit by fast-moving watercraft. But we also see propeller injuries in birds. This is a loon from Watchik Lake here in Maine. Not just boats that bother loons. It's the disturbance of even the slowest moving boats, like old people like me in kayaks. Um, you know, loons with chicks, loons on the nest are incredibly sensitive to disturbance. And oftentimes people just want a little closer look, or they want to get a photograph or something of that nature, and they disturb the loons. And this can be hugely problematic. So on both ends, we have to be really careful. We see gunshot. You wouldn't, some of this may be mistaken identity, particularly for those loons in winter plumage that don't look like the calendar loon. But sometimes, unfortunately, this is malevolent behavior on the part of people who are shooting them with bullets, who are shooting them with shotguns. And unfortunately, this is fairly frequent. Entanglement in fishing line. This is turning out to be a much bigger issue. In fact, it seems the number of cases we see with entanglement in fishing lines seems to be increasing year to year. There was actually a big growth in fishing as a hobby during COVID. People could go out and do it for fun. And I think that sort of introduced a lot more entanglement problems. So getting people to use different fishing line, to not leave old line in the field, to collect any line so that wildlife doesn't get tangled in it is very important. And of course, hooks. Um, if the fish gets away because the line breaks or the angler lets it go, sometimes the fish will have fishing gear in it. And if the loon catches the fish, it gets the hook, and that can certainly be problematic for the loon. But the other thing that's even worse for the loon than the fish hook is often the weight that's attached to the fishing line, and that's can cause lead poisoning. Unfortunately, the vast majority of fishing weights still used in the United States, around the world, are lead. Um, and they kill an awful lot of loons. So this is a loon's stomach. This is the lower part of the stomach, the gizzard. And you can see some fish bones in there and pebbles. Loons always have pebbles in the gizzards. And you can see the hook, which actually isn't doing anything damaging, but that object right there is a split shot that's made out of lead, and that's what killed the bird. If we get them early enough and the bird is still alive and the lead levels aren't too high, we can sometimes get the lead out by endoscopy or surgery or gastric lavage and hopefully save the loon. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work. And oftentimes the loons come in too far gone to be able to do that. When you look at data, and this is data that was compiled by the Maine Division of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, you see that lead poisoning is the largest single cause of mortality in adult loons in Maine. Of course, the thing that's just as large is unknown. Even with all of our post-mortem examinations, a lot of these things we can't tell. And again, if we have time in the question section, we can talk about how to do that better. But we get a lot of trauma, boat trauma. We get a lot of fungal respiratory disease, a lot of entanglement, and fish hooks and things of that nature. In many areas, one of the things that has been done or is in the process of doing is trying to educate the public and introduce legislation to eliminate the use of lead for hunting and fishing. There are non-toxic alternatives. We're not trying to get people to stop hunting and fishing. We're trying to get people to use non-toxic products. And Maine and New Hampshire have been states that have led in this for many years. We haven't solved the problem yet, but we've made significant progress. And of course, in trying to eliminate lead from a lot of hobbies, we're not just trying to protect the individual loon or the individual eagle. We don't want lead in the environment. We don't want our children exposed to lead. This is bad stuff. And we really need to eliminate it from many more products. So when we're thinking about other issues that we're studying in loons, we get into some of these questions. The question of climate change, is that having some effect on loons and loon populations? Development around lakes for energy, for recreation, water quality issues. pollution issues. And let's get into some of those. And the first one, of course, is climate change. Um, we know the climate is changing. The image on the right of Massachusetts is a projection from the Union of Concerned Scientists of what the Massachusetts climate will be like at the end of this century if we don't do something about emissions. And what they're saying is if we keep going with our carbon emissions and methane emissions and everything else, by the end of the century, Massachusetts will have a climate like South Carolina. Now, that's not deadly. There are people who live in South Carolina and enjoy it, but there's no winter, there's no skiing, there's no sugar maples, there's no loons. Um, and it's a very different ecological scenario. We also know that sea level is rising due to climate change, and this has effects on wintering loons. And of course, the climate change also changes rainfall, which has effects on lakes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things that has been noted is that in the last 100 years, if you look at the black dotted line on this map and the red dotted line, the black dotted line is the southern limit of where common loons bred 100 years ago. The red dotted line is the southern limit of where common loons breed now, and you'll notice it's moving north. Why is this? Is it human population? Is it development? Is it climate? Is something going on with the water? Or is it all of those things? This is from a relatively recent National Audubon Society report. And what you'll see here is that we are already having range loss in common loons in the southern part of the state. We've noticed in southern New Hampshire, southern Maine, southern Minnesota, and things of that nature, that loon reproduction is decreasing. Whereas in the very northern part of this map, the light blue, it was too icy for loons to breed before. There wasn't open water, but small ponds have started to open up and more loons are starting to breed up in that area. The whole thing is shifting north. This is from work that has been done at LPC in New Hampshire. And what they're noticing is that as we get more extreme weather events with some of these climate changes, you get fewer loon chicks hatched per pair. So reproduction is going down. Partly this is due to changes in water level. This is a loon nest. You'll notice that those two eggs are underwater because of the heavy spring rains. And again, we showed before, the loon's nest right at the edge of the water. There's not much leeway there for water level changes for the loons. Changes in water quality as we get warmer lakes, as we get changes in pH, as we get more input of nutrients from people's septic systems or lawn chemicals or things of that nature, forest clearing, you get more algal blooms, you get more contaminants. And all of these things are certainly not good for loon breeding. Walter Piper's work in the Midwest has shown that as water quality goes down, as visibility in the water goes down, loon reproduction shrinks dramatically. The other thing with increased temperatures is these are water birds and they're out of the water to breed, and people who have loon cams are noticing that the adults on the nest are panting more often. They're having to get out of the nests and go back in the water to cool off more often. And that leaves the eggs vulnerable to predators, and the eggs vulnerable to overheating. If any of you have ever hatched eggs in an incubator, whether it's chicken eggs or anything else, you'll know that the eggs have a very narrow range of incubation, narrow range of temperature and humidity. And as the climate increases, not only adults overheating, the eggs are overheating. The other temperature thing that we see is an increase in things like biting flies, more mosquitoes, more black flies. This is a loon on a nest in Wisconsin, and the loons were so bad, I think 3 years ago in Wisconsin, that about a third of the loons abandoned their nests early in the season, tried to renest later on in the summer after black fly season, and didn't do very well. So not only could these black flies carry parasites, but they can just pester the loons enough that they want to jump in the water, and I don't blame them. Of course, these things, the mosquitoes and the black flies can carry parasites, and one of the things that's new that we first saw on Lake Umbagog here in Maine, in 2015, we had the first loon ever in the world die from avian malaria here in Maine. And since then, we have found that every year we're getting more and more cases of avian malaria in loons. It's quite fatal. This is work that we're collaborating with Maine Audubon and BRI and LPC and University of Vermont and University of New Hampshire and to try and figure out what's going on. And then, of course, the question is, can we do anything? Fungal respiratory disease. You don't want your lungs or air sacs, if you're a bird, to be filled with what look like bread mold. And unfortunately, warmer, wetter weather and rotting vegetation favors the growth of a lot of molds. And we are starting to see more and more fungal disease in loons as well. Another thing that we're seeing more of is new parasites. Well, this is a nasty one, thorny-headed worms, acanthocephala. You do not want these in your intestines. And we're trying to figure out where they're coming from. One of the issues with this kind of parasite is they've got a complicated life cycle. They need an invertebrate as an intermediate host, and some of the introduced invertebrates, like this is the Chinese mystery snail, or and I'm trying to think which crayfish this is, the emerald crayfish, I think. I would have to go back and check on that. These have been introduced as bait. They've been introduced through the pet trade. They've been introduced in a number of ways to lakes across North America. And these can serve as, unfortunately, good hosts for some of these new parasites that are beginning to affect loons and other aquatic species. Botulism. Again, growing in enriched aquatic environments with exotic invertebrates like quagga mussels and things, dramatically changing water quality, but also often poisoning loons. At the moment, this is only a problem periodically on the Great Lakes. But when you have a botulism outbreak on one of the Great Lakes, you can see rafts of just dead birds washing up on the beach from botulinum toxin. Another toxin that we're starting to see, and I've cheated a little bit with this, and this is an electron microscope picture from a bald eagle's brain. I didn't have one. But this is called AVM, avian vacuolar myelinopathy, which is a nasty thing. But basically, if you know what a normal brain looks like, all those big circles in there, they're like holes punched in the brain. Those are the vacuoles that they're talking about. And so this is caused by a toxin that's produced by algae in water that has too many nutrients and is too warm. And it was first seen in bald eagles in the southern part of the country, in Alabama and Missouri and so forth. We have seen it a couple of cases here in New England, particularly in Vermont. We've got a couple of loons that have shown up with this, and it's scary because we're seeing more algal blooms on more lakes. Other emerging things, one is pox virus. Pox virus is carried by biting flies, again, things like black flies and mosquitoes. And these are 3 pictures of loon chicks with pox viral lesions. They're sort of tumor-like masses. Sometimes if the chick's immune system is strong enough, they can fight these off and survive the experience, but sometimes these are fatal. And we're following a few of these at this point. West Nile virus is an emerging disease, and of course, high pathogen avian influenza that we're all worried about. So one of the things we do in our mortality studies is take samples to go to laboratories where the real experts, the molecular geneticists and the histopathologists and things can try and figure out what's going on with these disease problems. And of course, with high pathogen avian influenza, we've got to protect ourselves because this is something that is communicable, potentially to people. Certainly, it's being seen in cats, it's being seen in dairy cattle, it's being seen in marine mammals. Um, and this is one reason that if you're picking up dead birds, you want to be careful. And so this has even affected our field work. For the biologists and students out now studying loons in the field, we have to wear personal protective equipment too, to make sure that we keep the loons safe and we keep ourselves safe as we're doing these procedures. Pollutants are an issue. We won't have a chance to get into every pollutant. Jim Peruk at St. Joseph's College has done some really nice work on oil-related pollutants in loons. There's some work being done right now on some of the forever chemicals, PFAS, PFOS, and microplastics. We've just published our first paper on microplastics in loons with College of the Atlantic. And many people are now studying the forever chemicals and PCBs. Tiffany Grade in this picture at LPC is looking at PCBs, in particular, some of the legacy chemicals on Squam Lake. This is sort of a frightening piece of information. This is an unpublished graph. This hopefully will go into publication in the next few years. But one of the things that this has shown, they've done an analysis of thousands of pieces of data from the United States and Canada, and they're showing that although loon populations are seeming to do okay, remember, loons are long-lived. An adult can live 30 or 40 years. Loon populations are okay. Loon reproduction, continent-wide, seems to be going down. And so one of the things we do is we try and connect these loon networks. We want everybody to be communicating with everybody else. And so we have monthly Zooms with biologists from all over the United States and Canada to talk about this. We've got one collaborator in Iceland. He doesn't get on very well. There is one biologist that I know of, Diana Solineva in Russia, who works on loons. They don't have common loons in Siberia, but they've got the other 4 species. We haven't talked to Diana in some time. The Russian relations are hard to come by. But trying to get everybody in communication and share this information is incredibly important. And so we work with Birds Canada a lot. They're great people up there. We work with the groups in Vermont, the groups in New Hampshire, New York State, loon biologists, network of people in the Midwestern states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan have a lot of active loon conservation efforts. There is a new National Loon Center being built. They've broken ground for it in Cross Lake, Minnesota. I was Zooming with them this morning, actually. So good folks out there. There are not too many loons in the northwestern states, but the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that multi-state system, has a loon study working group. They've got annual meetings. They're great meetings. I've been out to some of those. And very dedicated people out there in Yellowstone National Park and Glacier National Park. And they connect to a citizens group in Montana, the Montana Loon Association, run by Lynn Kelly. Montana actually has a loon license plate, and funds from the license plate go back to loon conservation in Montana. Washington State has a small but active loon program. They've only got, I think, currently 17 lakes in northeastern Washington that loons run, but a lot of loons winter off the Washington coast. And we had our last national in-person symposium in 2014. We were supposed to have one in 2019, but COVID happened. We're hoping when the new national center opens in Minnesota, our next in-person national meeting will be out there in a couple of years. As I said before, we have Zoom groups. We have 3 working Zoom groups that meet regularly to discuss loon rehabilitation and conservation issues. And if any of you are interested in getting involved in any of those groups, let me know, and I can put you in touch with the heads of them. We have a lot of collaborators in a lot of states, and it's hard to thank everybody when there are this many people, but it wouldn't happen without people from all over the US and Canada's involvement and sharing. In Maine, there's several, I think, really good sources that one can go to for more information. Maine Audubon has a bunch of brochures on their site. Maine Lakes has some wonderful loon information on their site. And Maine Audubon also has a connection to the Fishing Lead Free program, which I think is really important because we really have to educate anglers that they can do all the fishing they want to do and they can do it safely and they can protect loons from a lot of the problems that they're currently facing. Lots that we can do as individuals. So it's always good to quote George Schaller. In terms of, this is sort of the plea at the end of the talk kind of thing. If any of you are interested in or in a position to make donations to help with this part of loon conservation, the science-y mortality laboratory-based studies, there are three groups that one you could consider donating to. One would be the program at College of the Atlantic. One would be the program at Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, which really coordinates an awful lot for this state. The other would be the work that we do down at Tufts. There's always good reading. I can't recommend enough Judy McIntyre's book, University of Minnesota Press, 1988. You can probably pick it up on Amazon for $3 or $4. It's out of print. It's sort of science-y. This one, Joan Dunning's book, is even older than Judy's. It's literature. It's poetic. It's beautifully written. And again, I'm sure you can pick it up cheap. A current book, Jim Peruk is at St. Joseph's College here in Maine, and this is sort of his adventures as a lifetime loon biologist. Beautifully written, a great read, and Jim's a great guy. So buy his books. What can I say? Okay, and I think we've got some time for questions. I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Mark. I am always amazed at all of the difficulties that loons face, so I'm appreciative of whenever I do get to see them out on the lakes. But thank you for sharing all of that information and for all of the work that's being done. There's a lot of really intelligent and thoughtful people working to conserve loons. So as I said at the beginning, we can put questions in the Q&A or in the chat located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Mark, I do see one already. So this one says, this summer, a loon came onto our shore in Blue Hill Harbor in August, almost daily for a few weeks, and then was found dead in the same spot to which it had been coming. What could have caused this?
It's a great question. Hopefully somebody collected it and either we've got it in a freezer at Fisheries and Wildlife. The interesting piece of that is the fact that it was coming ashore for an extended period of time before it was found dead. And so there's something chronic going on here. We did have a very small number, 2 or 3 loons found along the shore, mostly down in the southern part of Maine, York and Scarborough, that came in dead, that died acutely. And that was high path avian influenza. And we only saw a couple of cases in loons last year. And it was during spring migration. So those were like March, April. And 2 years in a row, we've seen high path avian influenza in migrating loons that time of year. We have tested about 3,500 loons for high path avian influenza over the last few years. And I mean, we have found fewer than 6. So high path, it's not like gulls or bald eagles or crows where we have hundreds of them dying from high path avian influenza. It seems to be a very uncommon disease in loons. This bird had something else. So all I can do now is guess. What's chronic that would cause a bird on the ocean to be coming in and beaching itself? And so it could be a previous injury, and it had an infection inside, or it wasn't able to dive well enough to catch food or something of that nature. Loons don't do well if they've got a bad foot injury. They really need both feet to swim underwater well. If they've got an eye injury, some birds can survive well with one eye in the wild. Loons cannot. Loons will slowly die if they've got a bad eye. And so it could be an injury like that. We have seen things like shark bites in loons. We have seen loons on the ocean attacked by seals and have seal bites. Um, and uh, uh, Parasites, we talked about those thorny-headed worms, acanthocephalans. So the short answer is I don't know. It could be a number of things. Um, if we've got the location, Blue Hill Harbor, and if somebody actually did recover the body, hopefully somebody called the warden service and maybe we can find out. I could search the database for Blue Hill Harbor and see what's there. But as I say, I'm guessing at this point.
All right, thank you. If people are thinking of other questions, I want to come back to something you just kind of touched on, and it was about loons fighting each other. You
Uh,
referred to one as a she. So could you talk to us a little bit about, like, you see males and females, right?
yeah, when we started this out, I had the typical gender biases that I think a lot of biologists have. Um, And so you think about male loons. They're a little bit bigger than the females. They're the ones who defend the territories. They're the only ones who yodel. They're out there, doing the calls, and they're apparent the alpha males. You see them all the time doing this stuff. The females are more in the background. They're a little bit more demure, perhaps. Um, and and the biologists who are in the field virtually never report seeing females fighting. And I've talked to people back to Judy McIntyre many years ago. Virtually all the reports you see are, male aggression kind of stuff. When we started looking at these sternal wounds in loons, um, we were amazed that we saw as many and they were as severe in the females as they were in the males. And we had a student do a project on this where we looked at 400 and something loons that had been in loon fights and quantified the number and severity of the holes in their sternum. Males and females came out exactly even. And so what we know from this is the females are getting into as many fights as the males, and the fights are as serious and can be as fatal as in the males, but they're doing it when nobody's watching. Um, or they're being much more. So is it taking place underwater? We know some loon fights take place underwater. Or if any of you have been on lakes, loon lakes, during the breeding season, you see the loons active during the day, but what do you hear at night? You hear a lot of vocalizations and a lot of social activity, and sometimes very active calling back and forth and aggressive calls in the middle of the night with loons. And there has been very little research on nocturnal behavior in loons. Judy McIntyre did a little bit, Jim Peruk did one study, but there are very few published papers on this. And I keep going to loon meetings and saying to people, we need more knowledge. I mean, we've got all this fancy technology. You can go out, you can go to Cabela's, you can buy night scopes, infrared, or all kinds of different scopes to watch wildlife at night. And nobody's used these for any extent on loons at this point. I think there's an open area for nocturnal research in loons to learn about this stuff. So, yeah, it's interesting, Brooke. The females are just as aggressive. I think, part of this is a bias on the part of the male biologists because most of the field biologists doing the field work for many years were men. But part of it is the females are doing their aggressive behavior different times, different locations, something where it's not as easily observed.
Another opportunity for a student or grad student,
Absolutely.
right?
Well, absolutely. Not just students, citizen scientists.
Yeah.
A lot of people who live on lakes, they're part of their lake associations. They love their loons. They sometimes will help organizations like Maine Audubon put out nesting platforms and things of that nature. And I think getting more participation in data gathering by these citizen scientists on the lake and making sure that their data gets to an organization like Maine Audubon or Maine Lakes or you guys or somebody who can compile and share the data is hugely important.
Yeah, wonderful. And I want to also stop and mention too that this talk, I know Dr. Pokras shared a lot of contacts, some websites, some addresses. So if you want to revisit any of these slides, this will be reposted on our YouTube page probably early next week at the latest. So if you want to check it out again to get some more of that information, it will be up on the BHHT YouTube page shortly. And I'll also mention that Jim Peruk did a talk for us 5 or 6 years ago. So you can find that on the YouTube page too. So another question, do they always return to the same lake where they were born? Do scientists understand this navigation capability?
Excellent questions. And I can partially answer those. I can at least lead you in the right direction. A bunch of people, including Dave Evers at BRI and Judy McIntyre and Walter Piper and Jay Maker, a number of other people have looked at this first question about the same lake where they were born. And it turns out with common loons that it's the males that pick the breeding territory. As with wrens, as with red-winged blackbirds, as with a lot of birds, the males migrate back first and sort of choose the territories, and then the females go around and try and pick the males that have the best territories. And what a number of people have shown, and I think Dave Evers included this in his PhD work, is that the males want to get back to as close as possible to the exact territory that they hatched from. If possible, they will go back to the same island, the same exact nest that they hatched from. If not, it's like concentric circles. They'd like to be within half a mile, a mile. They're almost always within, 5 or 10 miles of where they hatch. They show a lot of site fidelity, is what this is called. What this also means from a conservation point of view is if there are open areas where you wish loons could be, loons are bad at exploiting that. Loons are not good at exploring new territories. They want their home bodies. They want to go back home. The females are a little less site fidelity oriented than the males are because the females are choosing the males and the quality of the male's territory. So a little bit broader, but yeah, they tend to stay closer to home. In terms of the navigation capabilities, there's been and again, my knowledge on this is not up to date. So there has been so much work done on the navigation capabilities of birds, excuse me, in general. Hold on. Having to do with using geographic markers, having to do with using celestial markers, positions of the sun, stars at night, things of that nature, even having to use magnetic fields. There's been a lot of work in birds and in marine mammals and in fish on use of fields for orientation. Because no one's ever been able to keep loons in captivity to do research on, we don't have direct, instrumented loons that were kept in the lab, as has been done with, cormorants or sparrows or many other species. So I think we're extrapolating from other species. But, loons do migrate during the day and to a lesser extent at night. They tend to come down on bodies of water at night. And I think when you talk to people who study loon migration, Paul Spitzer in Maryland does a lot of this. His feeling is that they're using geographic features, mountains, forests, lakes positions, things of that nature for their migration. Of course, this doesn't explain loon chicks on their first migrations, because if you look at, let's take a family of loons on Green Lake in Maine or something like that. You got two adults and ideally two chicks in the fall, this time of year, and they're all getting antsy. They're getting ready to migrate out to the ocean. The adults leave. Um, they're gone, and they leave the chicks on the lake. The chicks are migrating weeks or sometimes months after the adults. Um, and they've never done this before. So there must be some innate component to that as well. Um, and certainly again, my knowledge is out of date, but looking at some of the things that were done early on, some of the magnetic orientation stuff that has been shown in passerine birds, um, and I think it's genetic. It is built in. What people have done, again, this has been done in Europe with passerines and with storks and with some raptors and things of that nature, is they'll take young chicks that never migrated and move them someplace geographically and say, did these chicks go in the direction they were supposed to go and end up in the wrong place? Or did they go to the right place even though it's the wrong direction? And it's different from species to species. There's a scientist at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, Martin Wikelski, who's sort of one of the world's experts on this kind of stuff. And if you want to learn a lot more about the factors of migration in loons, go to Project Icarus on the Max Planck Institute website, and Marty Wikelski's information will take you everywhere you want to go.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to say it's a little bit past 5. So we advertised this program from 4 to 5 p.m. So we went a little bit over. Thank you to those who have stayed and listened. And if you have other questions about this program, please feel free to email us at DHHT. We can get them to Mark. We can work out a way to get you some information if you had questions that weren't answered today. But as I said, this talk will go up on our YouTube page soon. Free programs like this one are made possible because of our donors. So if you've been a donor to BHHT, we want to thank you for your support. And if you're interested in donating, please visit our website. It makes it very easy. And also our partner, IHT, they have a website too with an easy way to donate. So we thank you so much for your support, for supporting programs like this one. Next month, we will be doing another Friends from the Field. More information will be coming about that soon. So please keep an eye on our social media. And Mark, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon and for sharing your knowledge. I always love hearing talks of yours. And yeah, just thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here with us.
Oh, I'm happy to do it, and hopefully I've made some new friends on the participants list there. I see my sister-in-law there. Hi, Nancy. Um, and Charlie Todd was on there. Charlie, if you're still on there, send me an email. All right.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop recording.